Today we're going to be talking about Part 2 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, called The Transformation of Money into Capital. That includes chapters 4, 5, and 6. We'll begin with chapter 4, called The General Formula for Capital, which is a key part of Marx's argument. But before we get to the formula for capital, we're first going to talk about the formula for the circulation of commodities. The formula for the circulation of commodities is CMC. It stands for a commodity that's transformed into money, which is transformed into another commodity, or CMC. CMC is the circuit of circulation of commodities. Imagine I'm a cobbler, so I could produce the commodity shoes. I take those shoes to the market and sell them for money. That's the first transformation from C to M. Then I take that money, bring it to the market, buy the commodities I need to live. I buy food, clothes, shelter, education, childcare, and all of those things. Marx calls this cycle selling in order to buy, and contrasts this with the general formula for capital, which is MCM. Now with MCM, the capitalist starts with money and uses that money to buy certain commodities, which are put into a production process and used to produce new commodities, which are then sold for money. This is buying in order to sell. Marx calls the first step, M to C, an advance of capital, and the second step, C to M, the realization of capital. And notice there's money on both sides of this equation for the general formula of capital. Now, of course, it would not make any sense to throw money into circulation from the point of view of a capitalist if only the same amount of money came back. Therefore, another way of writing this formula is MCM prime, where M prime is greater than M. By buying in order to sell, what we would call investing today, the capitalist hopes that they'll be able to transform their money into more money. Marx points out differences between these two formulas. First, the path CMC begins and ends with a commodity, but of course those commodities are different in kind, of different qualities, different use values. The first commodity we have to sell is different from the commodity we need to buy. The first C in the cycle are not use values to their original owners. They're only a means to get use values that the owners need. The goal of this circuit, this exchange, is consumption. Marx says consumption, the satisfaction of wants, in one word, use value, is its end and aim. Therefore, in this process, we transform the quality of a commodity into another commodity and use them up. We consume the food we buy, the clothes we wear, etc. And after we consume those new commodities, we don't have anything left. We have to go back again in this cycle of CMC in order to get the things we need to live over and over again forever. While the beginning and end of the commodity cycle is a commodity, on the other hand, the path or cycle MCM begins with money and ends with money. This is not about the qualitative change in use values. Instead, this is about the quantitative change in exchange value. Of course, this cycle does not make any sense unless more money is coming out at the end. In the context of classical political economy, this is a very important and innovative concept of Marx. When you subtract M from M prime, you get this excess over the original value advanced, which Marx defines as surplus value. Surplus value is a key term within Marx's political economy that does include our modern sense of profit, but in fact includes a lot more than that. But we'll get to that later. In MCM, it would be absurd if M equaled M and the capitalist ended up with the same amount of money at the end of the cycle. In this case, the hoarder's plan would be better to just hoard the money and keep it in a vault. But capital accumulation is different from simply hoarding because it involves entering the cycle of production. One thing to take from this is that not all money is capital, but that money that is used in a certain way is capital. This speaks to Marx's using relational definitions. His concepts are not static building blocks, but point to dynamic relationships. Another difference in comparing the two cycles is that at the end of the CMC cycle, the goal is outside of circulation. The goal is getting the new use values which we consume in order to satisfy our needs. They're used up and do not re-enter the circulation process. But in the MCM cycle, the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself. Marx calls this the valorization of value, or the production of surplus value. And this only happens within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore limitless. Rather than stopping when we receive the essential use values or commodities we need in order to live our lives, if we measure our accumulation in terms of money, there really are no limits. This is one of the unique features of capitalism that Marx illuminates through this analysis. Marx talks about the capitalist, what he calls the conscious bearer of this movement, as capital personified and endowed with a consciousness and a will. To a capitalist, these use values never really are the aim. The aim is always the production of use values in order to valorize value, in order to create new surplus value, in order to create profit for the capitalist. This, what Marx calls the boundless drive for enrichment, the passionate chase after value, is what defines the capitalist under capitalism. So now we're talking about Chapter 5, Contradictions in the General Formula, which is the second chapter of Part 2, the transformation of money into capital. Marx here sets out a mystery, a kind of political economy detective story. In the CMC cycle, in simple commodity circulation, what happens in the exchange process is a metamorphosis, a change in the form of value. Remember, Marx talked about value being immaterial but objective. Here we have the same quantity of value passing through different forms. The commodity that we have at the start of the cycle is representative of a certain amount of socially necessary labor time that it took to create it. In Chapter 1, Marx defines socially necessary labor time as the time required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. Commodities that are produced with the same amount of socially necessary labor time have the same value. So we go into the market and sell the commodity for money. That amount of money is equivalent to the same amount of socially necessary labor time as the initial commodity. Then we buy a different commodity that we need, which is also representative of the same amount of socially necessary labor time as the commodity we've started with. What's changed is the commodity from one use value to another. But the value that underlies them, the socially necessary labor time, stays the same. Although the form of use value has changed, that doesn't imply any change in the magnitude of value. The amount of value, or socially necessary labor time underlying it, has not changed. Therefore, when we have exchange in the market of commodities with one another directly, or commodities exchanged via money, we have an exchange of equivalence. Another way to say this is an exchange of equal exchange values. No one gets more value from exchange than they've put into it in the first place. The classical political economists held that circulation was an exchange of equivalent values, but that would seem to imply that the formation of surplus value doesn't take place. So how does this problem get solved? Marx has to resolve this seeming contradiction that on the one hand, we have an exchange of equivalence in a market, but on the other hand, the capitalist ends up with more surplus value on the other side of the MC-M' cycle. Marx was of course aware that unequal exchange is also common, but he points out that though through such a transaction one seller gets rich at the expense of others, but that phenomena cannot be generalized, hence cannot be used as an explanation of surplus value as something that arises from circulation. Marx says the capitalist class as a whole in any country cannot overreach themselves. So if unequal exchange can't explain why capitalists have more surplus value on the other side of the circulation process, something else must be found. The assumptions of classical political economy defined exchange as the exchange of equivalents in a market. Marx says, the money owner, who's yet only a capitalist in larval form, must buy his commodities at their value, sell them at their value, and yet at the end of the process withdraw more value from circulation than he threw in at the beginning. His emergence as a butterfly must and yet must not take place in the sphere of circulation. How do we resolve this apparent contradiction? Marx leaves the answer to this problem to Chapter 6. We've made it to Chapter 6, the sale and purchase of labor power. This is the last chapter in Part 2, the transformation of money into capital. Marx has set up the problem in the previous 2 chapters. On the one hand, a capitalist would not invest their money as capital unless on the promise of making even more money at the end of the process. On the other hand, what happens in the realm of exchange is only the exchange of equivalents, or value changing form. In Chapter 6, Marx reveals the solution to this mystery. He says, in order to extract surplus value out of the consumption of a commodity, the money owner must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation, on the market, a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value. The capitalist does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labor. In other words, labor power. This is different from labor, which is not a thing but an activity and cannot be sold. Labor power, like surplus value, is another important conceptual innovation of Marx's over classical political economy. Labor power means our capacity or our capability to work. This is a key insight because this is how to solve the problem of the exchange of equivalents resulting in surplus value. There is this special commodity on the market under capitalism, which the capitalist can buy and has the use value of creating value. In other words, when the capitalist pays us wages in order to work, they're purchasing our labor power, our capacity to work. The use value of the commodity labor power is that it creates new value, because we apply our hands and our brains to the process of commodity production. Like any other commodity, labor power has both a use value and an exchange value. The use value of labor power is its ability to create new value in the production process. And like any other commodity, this commodity has an exchange value that's defined by the socially necessary labor time it takes to create that commodity. In many cases, we're paid just enough in wages for us to be able to do our work today and show up for work tomorrow. So we need enough wages to buy food to eat, have shelter, maybe health care, etc. The wage may also include enough to support the worker's family members to provide the next generation of workers. And wages vary from country to country based on historical factors like colonialism, imperialism, and the balance of forces between the working class and the capitalist class. This special commodity, labor power, is the secret to the mystery of the source of surplus value. The capitalist can buy labor power on the terms of the market and indeed pay its full value, in the sense of the socially necessary labor time it takes to reproduce that labor power. At the same time, the capitalist can expect to take maximum advantage of the use value provided by the labor power by us actually laboring in the production process to create more value than it cost the capitalist in terms of exchange value. Finding labor power for sale on the market is an unusual circumstance, and one that's unique to the capitalist mode of production. Marx says, for the transformation of money into capital, the owner of money must find the free worker available on the commodity market. This worker must be free in the double sense. First, that as a free individual, he or she can dispose of their labor power as their own commodity. On the other hand, they have no other commodity for sale. They are free of all the means of production, the tools, the materials, etc., needed for the realization of their labor power. The twice-free worker is Marx's first definition of the proletariat in Capital. Now, the origins of the twice-free worker in Marx's sense are very important because it gives us insight into the unique nature of the capitalist mode of production. On the one hand, the worker under capitalism is not like a slave under ancient slavery, in the sense that they're not owned outright by another person. We are free to enter into a contract in order to sell our labor power in exchange for wages. We could decide to work for one employer or another employer. We're not bound in the same way as subordinate classes in the past. But the second freedom, which is kind of a sarcastic freedom, this is Marx's sense of humor coming out here, that the worker is free of the means of production. Now, human beings have existed for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. For most of that history, we were able to manage a sustenance form of life by hunting and gathering, and for the last 12,000 years or so by farming. But now Marx is talking about the rise of industrial capitalism over the past few hundred years, and especially as it was unfolding in Manchester and other parts of Europe and the United States in the 19th century. What had preceded this was a whole history of the severing of former peasants off of their land, off of any ability for them to socially reproduce, from their ability to live other than to sell their labor to the capitalist. They have no land or farms of their own that they could work and grow food. They have no workshop of their own. They don't have tools of their own in order to create their own commodities to sell at the market. They're free of all of those means of production, in that all they have left to sell is their ability to work. We're free of everything else. This is not something that Marx goes into very much in this chapter, but is something that he returns to in Part 8 of Capital in the section on primitive accumulation. There he goes into the violent and bloody history of the separation of the serfs from their land and the transition from feudalism to capitalism. What's important here is that under capitalism we have this twice-free worker that is the basis for the production of surplus value. We have the tiny class of capitalists who own all the means of production, and the huge class of workers who own nothing but our ability to work. There is a formal equality in the market in which a worker doesn't have to work for one capitalist their whole life. We could work for a different capitalist. We could enter a contract, work for them for a period of time, and then work for someone else. There's a sense of equality in the market. But looking at the actual social relations which underlie this phenomena of the twice-free worker, there's a massive power disparity between the capitalists who own the means of production and the workers who own nothing but our ability to work and are compelled to work for the capitalist in order to get wages in order to eat. We have no other way of sustaining ourselves under capitalism. What Marx wants to show from here is to truly understand this power imbalance and the actual phenomena of exploitation. We must follow the worker and the capitalist out of the realm of circulation and into the hidden abode of production, and examine the production process in detail in order for us to truly understand the source of surplus value in the exploitation of the worker. That is now the next section to which we turn.